"Good morning, honey." He heard it before he understood it, before his eyes opened, before the headache found its full weight behind his temples and the previous night began its slow, ugly reassembly. A kitchen. Not his. A woman at the counter barefoot, unhurried, holding coffee with both hands like the situation required no explanation. Because for her, it didn't. He was wearing yesterday's shirt. One sock. The particular expression of a man who has just realized that the most controlled chapter of his life ended sometime around midnight and he wasn't paying attention when it happened. She didn't turn around. Won. "The plant won," she said. Outside, Atlanta was waking up, steel and glass catching the first light, the city already running at the pace of people with somewhere to be. In here, everything had stopped. Or started. He didn't know which yet. Neither did she. "Good morning, honey." That was the first thing Anthony Wilson heard on a Monday morning in a kitchen he had never seen before, wearing yesterday's dress shirt, one sock, and the specific variety of headache that makes a man question every confident sentence he has ever spoken out loud in front of witnesses. He stopped in the doorway. Vanessa Carter stood at the counter with a coffee mug in both hands, barefoot, calm, and wearing the kind of quiet amusement that had no business existing on a Monday before 7. She looked rested. She looked entertained. She looked like a woman who had prepared for exactly this moment and found it meeting her expectations, which was the most terrifying part. Because Vanessa Carter was the CEO of Carter Analytics, Atlanta's third-largest data consulting firm, a company her father had co-founded from a converted warehouse in Buckhead before she was old enough to drive. She was 34 years old and ran quarterly board meetings the way other people ran marathons, with total commitment, visible discipline, and absolutely no interest in stopping for anyone who couldn't keep pace. She had black loose waves that fell past her collarbone, cheekbones sharp enough to end arguments, and the model proportions of someone who had learned long ago that looking exactly like that in a room full of people who underestimated her was its own form of leverage. In 5 years of working under her at Carter Analytics, Anthony had never once seen her without a blazer, never heard her laugh without checking first whether it was appropriate, never imagined waking up with his face on the leather cushion of her guest room sofa, one shoe on and one shoe somewhere he could not currently locate. So naturally, he handled the situation with the full dignity of a grown man. "Please tell me that's not what I think it means." Vanessa lifted one eyebrow. "Precisely one." "Depends. What do you think it means?" "I think I need coffee before I answer that." "Smart." She turned back to the counter, cowardly, but smart. He looked down at himself. The shirt was salvageable. The sock situation was concerning. "Where's my other sock?" "Entryway." "Why is it in the entryway?" "You challenged my houseplant." She sipped from her mug without turning around. "The plant won." Anthony stood there, stared at the back of her head, waited for the sentence to make more sense. It did not make more sense. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And that was when the previous night started reassembling itself in his memory, coming back in the specific way. Bad decisions always do, not all at once, not with the mercy of a clean narrative, but in ugly little fragments that arrived out of order, and each one worse than the last. The company party. Downtown Atlanta, a rooftop venue that had seemed impressive in the invitation, and proved significantly less impressive once you factored in the line for the bar, and the fact that someone had selected appetizers based on what looked good in photographs, rather than what tasted like food. Carter Analytics held the event annually, always at a venue that said "we are doing well," without saying "we are showing off," which was its own form of showing off. Anthony had intended to leave by 9. Cedric Mitchell had prevented this. Cedric was 36, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who moved through rooms at full volume and treated every gathering as a personal opportunity. He had worked in client strategy at Carter Analytics for 4 years and operated with the baseline assumption that any event Anthony tried to leave early was an event that needed him. He had appeared at Anthony's elbow at 8:47, with a fresh drink and an expression of profound moral disapproval. "You're doing it again. I'm leaving at a reasonable hour." "You're leaving at an unreasonable hour, on the grounds that it feels reasonable to a man who has voluntarily structured his entire social life around not having one. Cedric pressed the drink into Anthony's hand. Stop living like a retired accountant at 34. The account closed. You're a person. Anthony had taken the drink. Because arguing with Cedric required energy, and the appetizers had been a disappointment, and the evening was already costing him something, so he might as well extract value from it. Vanessa had given a short speech around 9. Clean, direct, 20 words, fewer than anyone expected, which was a deliberate choice. She always spoke to the exact threshold of what the room needed and stopped there, which was one of several things that made people in those rooms feel simultaneously impressed and slightly off balance. Then she had been pulled into a circle near the far end of the bar, surrounded by directors and a woman from the board Anthony didn't recognize, and that should have been the last he saw of her for the evening. Except, Cedric started a bet. Not immediately, not obviously. It evolved, the way these things do when someone with Cedric's specific brand of social recklessness finds himself standing near the intersection of open bar and executive proximity. It started with a comment about the board. Somebody made a joke about the seating arrangement at the last quarterly meeting, and who had chosen to sit closest to the exit, and then it escalated, the way comments do, and then there was a napkin on the high-top table between Anthony and Vanessa Carter, who had materialized from her circle at some point Anthony hadn't tracked, and Cedric was saying something about nobody in operations knowing their own leadership structure. I know every board member, Anthony had said. Because he did. Because operations ran downstream of every decision those board members made, which meant operations spent a lot of time quietly mapping the decision makers to understand which decisions were coming before they arrived. In order? Vanessa had asked. In order of what? Most useless to most dangerous. He had looked at her. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, not wine. He catalogued that automatically. The same way he catalogued everything, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a challenge and not quite a test, and was exactly the combination of both. You think nobody can do that. I think it requires a level of internal observation that most people in operations don't have time for. You're underestimating how much time employees spend silently ranking executives during meetings. He kept his voice easy. We don't have phones out. We have to do something. She had laughed. Not the CEO version. Not the clean, appropriate, measured sound she deployed in conference rooms when someone said something genuinely clever. A real one. Short and unguarded, and slightly surprised, like it had gotten out before she could check whether it was appropriate, and she knew it, and for approximately 1 second, she didn't care. Someone put the napkin between them like a contract. Cedric started chanting. Cedric was, in Anthony's 8 years of knowing him, capable of becoming a one-man crowd in under 30 seconds, and he had just discovered a cause. The terms assembled themselves. Anthony lost. He would acknowledge in front of the full leadership team that operations was not the actual spine of the company. Vanessa lost. She would buy him breakfast. He asked what he got if he won. My respect, Vanessa said. I already have that. You keep approving my budget. She tilted her glass at him. Fine. Breakfast. Breakfast with the CEO sounds like a disciplinary meeting that comes with eggs. And yet you're still standing here. He won. Barely. He named all 9 board members in order, and the one he ranked most dangerous, not most powerful, not most visible, but most dangerous, which was a specific and important distinction, was Harold Reed. He would treat them with kindness. He had placed Reed at the top because Reed was the only board member who smiled during the parts of meetings where smiling meant something. People who smiled during operational disruptions were either uninvested or already knowing something. Anthony had never fully decided which applied to Reed, but either category warranted the ranking. Vanessa had looked at the list, said nothing for a moment. Then, that last one bothers me. Because I was wrong? Because you were too right. And then the night had gotten softer around the edges, the way evenings do when the formal part ends and the actual part begins. More people leaving. Volume dropping. The rooftop getting quieter. Said, would you treat them with kindness? Cedric had somehow acquired a conversation with the board member Anthony didn't recognize and was gesturing enthusiastically about something that appeared to involve sports statistics and municipal planning, which was Cedric's gift. He could find common ground with anybody if you gave him 40 seconds and didn't supervise. Anthony had stayed, and then the evening had blurred in the specific, non-alarming, but thoroughly inconvenient way that evenings, when you stop tracking them. And somewhere, in that blurring, he had apparently issued a formal diplomatic challenge to a houseplant. I genuinely don't remember the plant. It was unprovoked. Vanessa set a mug on the counter in front of him, handle turned outward. You said it had weak leadership. That does sound like me. You also said it was taking up square footage it hadn't earned. He sat down on the stool at the kitchen island. The leather was cool, and the coffee was excellent, and the situation was precisely as complicated as he deserved. How did I end up here? You didn't end up here. You arrived here via a sequence of decisions, each one technically voluntary. She leaned against the counter opposite him. You tried to get a ride. The app wasn't cooperating. You were not in great shape, but you were polite about it. Very insistent that you were fine. Very certain that you were handling the situation. Standing absolutely still on a sidewalk for 7 minutes is not handling the situation. I was thinking. You were arguing with your phone. Those things can coexist. You gave my driver your address as the apartment with the disappointing lamp. She watched him over the rim of her mug. I didn't know where that was. Anthony closed his eyes briefly. I would like to withdraw from society. You said that last night too. I told you society had a waiting list. I don't remember that either. You laughed. Then you said you'd get on the list early to avoid the rush. She moved to the toaster. You refused to call anyone. You kept saying you were a self-contained adult. That is accurate. It is not accurate when applied to a man standing on a sidewalk at midnight, insisting his phone has a personal vendetta against him. Phones do develop preferences. So I brought you here. Guest room, door closed, shoes by the door. One sock appears to have been involved in the plant situation. Nothing happened. The last 2 words were not reassuring in the way she meant them to be. They were reassuring in the way that made Anthony aware he had needed to hear them, which was its own kind of information about his head was at 7 in the morning in his boss's kitchen. I like my job, he said, because that was the cleanest version of the thing he needed to say. I know. She turned back to the toaster, frowned at it. You're not the only one. The toaster made a sound like a small mechanical protest and produced 2 slices of bread that were aggressively charred on the left side and completely unaffected on the right. Vanessa stared at them with the expression of a woman who had lost this argument before. Your toaster has a strong personality, Anthony said. It burns one side and ignores the other. She picked up a butter knife. I've been told that's called executive balance. That explains several departments. She pointed the knife at him. Not threateningly, just with emphasis. You are off-site, but you are not immune. Noted. Would you treat them with kindness? She put a plate in front of him and leaned on the counter with her mug, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was quiet in the way. And the kitchen was quiet. Kitchens are quiet when 2 people are doing the thing, where they're deciding whether to make the silence comfortable or to fill it before it becomes one. She moved like a person who knew her own space. Coffee, toast, a cabinet that stuck when she pulled it. The specific exasperation of someone who had been meaning to fix that for 3 months and kept deciding it could wait another week. Would you treat them with kindness? He had watched her run quarterly reviews with the precision of someone who had memorized the difference between a recoverable deficit and a structural failure. He had watched her sit at the head of that conference table and dismantle a sloppy vendor proposal in 6 sentences without raising her voice. He had filed performance reports to her for 5 years, read her margin notes, understood her priorities from the pattern of what she approved without comment versus what she returned with questions. He had not known she muttered at toasters. He had not known she made coffee before she did anything else. Not as a ritual but as a requirement. The way some people stretch before running because their muscles don't warm up otherwise. He had not known she owned houseplants that apparently had strong enough opinions to win arguments. For the record, Vanessa said, "You won the bet." "I know. Don't look so satisfied. I won breakfast. You won a technicality. I won because I correctly identified Harold Reed as the most dangerous rather than the most useless, which is a distinction that required actual analysis and not just observation." He took a bite of the toast. The burnt side was aggressive. The other side was fine. Also, the breakfast is good. The toast is terrible. The effort is good. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile yet. "Is this where you admit operations is the spine of the company? No, you're a sore loser. You haven't lost anything yet." "Strategic humility," she said. "That's what I'm practicing. That's a decent rebrand." He picked up his coffee. "I may steal it." She looked at him then. Not the CEO look, which was calibrated and purposeful, and designed to communicate exactly what it meant to communicate. This was something else, something that happened when the calibration was off, or maybe when it was set to a different channel, the one that wasn't about managing a room. "At the office," she said. "Normal, not a question, not quite a command. Something between the two, with a little bit of warning folded into the middle of it. I can manage normal. Can you? Historically? Barely. But I'll make an effort." The corner of her mouth did the thing again. More committed this time. He should have left after breakfast. He found his other sock in the entryway, next to a Boston Fern that looked completely unbothered by recent events. Her driver took him back to Midtown. He watched Atlanta wake up through the car window, the particular quality of a Monday morning in an ET that runs on ambition, where everybody on the sidewalk has somewhere urgent to be, and the urgency looks the same on all of them, until you learn to read the differences. His apartment was exactly where he had left it. Near Piedmont Park, 3rd floor, the kind of space that said functional and intentional, without saying anything else. Clean lines, good light in the morning from the east windows. A truck in the garage that he maintained carefully because it was the kind of vehicle that rewarded attention. A gym schedule he kept because routine was the container that held the rest of everything else in place. And the lamp. The lamp was by the reading chair. He had bought it 3 years ago because the previous lamp had burned out, and he needed a lamp, and this one was available, and he had not thought beyond that. It gave adequate light. It was unspectacular. His brother Raymond, calling from Cleveland on Sunday afternoons, had once asked about it over video, and spent 45 seconds analyzing everything it communicated about Anthony's relationship with his own living space. Raymond was a lot, but Raymond was not wrong, which was the irritating part about having a brother who was a lot. He had a way of stating observations so plainly that deflecting them required more energy than just acknowledging them, and Anthony had spent enough energy in his life on deflection to have strong opinions about when it was worth it and when it wasn't. He showered. He changed. Would you treat them with kindness? He stood in his kitchen with a second cup of coffee and thought about a woman who laughed at a houseplant challenge and made terrible toast with complete conviction, and then he put that thought in a specific drawer in the back of his mind and labeled it, "This is where we are not going," and went to work. Normal lasted 11 minutes. He was in the break room on the 4th floor, pouring his 3rd coffee of the day, because the morning had already been a lot, when Cedric appeared in the doorway, carrying a banana and wearing the expression of a man who had information he was physically struggling not to deploy. Morning. Anthony didn't look up. "Say whatever you're about to say and get it over with." "I'm not saying anything." Cedric peeled the banana with great deliberateness. "I'm just noting that you left the party without saying goodbye, which is unlike you, and that a very specific vehicle pulled away from the venue approximately 12 minutes after Vanessa Carter did. I got a ride." "Uh-huh. She was being responsible." "Uh-huh. You sound like a malfunctioning appliance." Cedric leaned against the counter. "You and Vanessa had a whole thing at the party. A bet. A vibe. You are 36. Stop saying vibe. I'll stop when you stop making sustained eye contact with CEOs over cocktail napkins." He took a bite of the banana. "Nothing happened. You don't have to tell me. I'm just saying I was there for the whole thing and it was a thing. Anthony picked up his coffee. Get back to work. Sure. Cedric grinned. Honey. Anthony stopped walking. Turned around. Cedric held his hands up. I respect your privacy. Entirely. 100%. I'm going back to my desk right now. Cedric. I control nothing and know nothing, and the schedule is your domain, and I value my assignments. Excellent choice. He made it to the conference room for the 10 o'clock strategy review with 30 seconds to spare. 6 people around the table. Lorraine Mitchell, from finance, who had the habit of speaking in sentences that had already been checked for risk before they left her mouth. She was 42. Methodical, with close cropped with kindness, with tetril hair, and the permanent expression of someone who had already done the math on whatever you were about to propose. Would you treat them with kindness? Dennis from product development, who treated complexity as a personal achievement and could bury a simple answer under 3 charts and 2 appendices without visible effort. 2 directors dialing in from the Dallas office. Cedric, who had somehow arrived before Anthony and was now sitting at the far end of the table with an expression of complete professional neutrality that cost him visible effort, and Vanessa at the head of the table. Navy blazer. Posture that said she had already read everything in front of her twice. The specific quality of stillness that expensive composure looks like when it's genuine rather than performed. Not a trace of the woman who had muttered at a toaster an hour and 20 minutes ago. She looked at Anthony when he sat down. Not meaningfully. Not with any particular weight. Just a glance in the rotation of glances a person at the head of a table makes when accounting for the room. Anthony. Operations perspective. He gave the update. Vendor delays out of the Memphis distribution partner, 3rd consecutive week. Systemic rather than situational. Needed to be escalated before the Dallas rollout timeline absorbed the damage. Staffing constraint in the Southeast regional team. 2 positions open for 6 weeks. Temporarily covered by cross-training that was stretching thin. The overall timeline would hold if product development stopped revising requirements every 48 hours. Dennis leaned back. That's a little dramatic. It's a little accurate. We're all working under pressure here. Then, stop adding pressure with late revisions. Every change at your end arrives as an emergency at mine. That's not pressure. That's a design choice that's being made on your behalf and absorbed on mine. Lorraine tapped her pen against the table once. The cost variance is already showing in the Q3 preliminary. Anthony's numbers are consistent with what I'm seeing. Vanessa looked at Dennis. Freeze the requirements by Friday. Dennis blinked. That's aggressive. What's aggressive is pretending the timeline can absorb a moving target indefinitely. She moved to the next item. Clean. No debate invited. Cedric made a very small sound into his hand. After the meeting, Anthony returned to his desk. His inbox had 14 unread messages. He processed 12 of them. The 13th was from Vanessa Carter. Subject line, strategic humility. The message said, "Your phrase has been stolen." He stared at it for a moment, then typed, "I'll invoice you." 20 seconds. Her response, "Breakfast was payment." He typed, "Burnt toast is not." 30 seconds. It was artisanal. He was still looking at the screen when Teresa Coleman walked past his desk. Teresa was 28, Vanessa's assistant, and she moved through the Carter Analytic office with the quiet confidence of someone who had a complete map of every person's stress tolerance and chose daily what to do with that information. She glanced at his screen without stopping, without commenting, with precisely the expression of a person who has seen exactly this sequence of events developing from a significant distance, and found it exactly as inevitable as predicted. Then she was gone. Anthony closed the email, pulled up the staffing report, got back to work. The next 2 weeks were a slow and controlled problem, which was the specific variety of problem Anthony was least equipped to ignore. Acute problems had clear action items. Slow problems required a different discipline, the kind where you knew something was building, and the most you could do was stay present and not look away. At the office, Vanessa didn't cross lines. Neither did he. There were no closed-door conversations that didn't need to be closed-door. No messages that wouldn't survive a compliance review. No lingering near each other's offices in ways that required explaining. But there was a pattern. Meetings would end and she would say, Stay back 2 minutes and ask one legitimate question and one that wasn't. The legitimate question always came first. How's the Memphis vendor situation resolving? Is the cross-training holding? And then, when the operational answer was finished, there was a beat, and then the other question arrived. Low stakes. Personal. The kind of thing people ask when they're checking whether someone is still the same person they thought they were. Is the lamp still disappointing? Profoundly, have you considered replacing it? I'm emotionally attached to a lamp. I work in operations. I observed it performing consistently under difficult conditions. I respect the process. She looked at him for a moment with the kind of expression that meant she was deciding whether to push on something and had decided not to. Then, that's the most you think you've said this week. It's Monday. You still peaked early. Across the office floor during all-hands updates, he would catch her watching him. Not staring, Vanessa didn't stare. That wasn't her mechanism. She noticed. There was a difference between those two things that most people missed, and he had been paying enough attention to understand it. Staring was broad and indiscriminate. Noticing was specific. It landed on particular things and stayed for a measured duration and then moved, and the person being noticed felt selected rather than observed. He didn't like how much he liked it. Would you treat them with kindness? One Thursday, she came down to the 4th floor with Teresa, which she sometimes did when she was moving through a decision-making pass of the building, a habit of hers, walking the floors rather than summoning people, which Anthony had always understood as a strategic choice about information gathering rather than a management preference. Teresa stopped by his desk first. She wants 5 minutes. Anthony looked past her. Vanessa was 12 feet away, reading something on a tablet with the focus of a woman who was definitely not listening to this conversation. She's standing right there. Yes. She could ask me herself. She asked me to make it feel official. Vanessa, without looking up, I did not. Teresa, serene, you said. Can you see if Anthony has 5 minutes? That is executive code for make it feel official. I'm surrounded by people who interpret everything. Competent people, Teresa said. There's a difference. Anthony stood. 5 minutes for what? Vanessa looked up from the tablet. Walk with me. They went past the glass-walled offices toward the back of the 4th floor, toward the small conference room that was usually empty on Thursdays. Because it was the room nobody wanted. Bad light. The projector had been replaced twice and still skipped, and the chairs were from a batch that had been purchased by someone who either didn't understand ergonomics or had very specific opinions about suffering. She stepped inside and left the door open. Smart, deliberate, still a line she was maintaining. She handed him the tablet. A draft restructuring plan for the client support division, consolidating coverage windows, reducing redundant staffing in the overnight TT, presenting it as efficiency optimization. He scanned it, understood it in 45 seconds. This cuts too close to response coverage. That's what I thought. Then why show me? Because Lorraine says it saves money. Dennis says it creates efficiency. Harold Reed says the board will appreciate the fiscal discipline. She watched him. And all three of those kindness, and all three of those phrases made me want to check whether the building had fresh air. It'll look good for 1 quarter and hurt you for 4. The overnight coverage isn't redundant, it's buffer. You eliminate buffer, and the first major client incident you don't catch in time costs more than 3 years of the savings. That's what I needed. You already knew. I wanted to hear you say it. That sounds dangerously close to using me as a conscience. I have one. She took the tablet back. It just functions better with corroboration. He should have left then. The 5 minutes were up. The information was exchanged. The purpose of the walk was complete. He stayed by the doorway. She noticed. She noticed things that was established. What? This is the 3rd time this week you've asked for a perspective you already had. Maybe you're useful. I'm definitely useful. I'm also wondering what you're actually doing. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in 5 years of working in the same building. Not CEO. Not calibrated. Something quieter. You don't act nervous around me. I do. I'm just disciplined. No. You push back. That's my job. Not everyone in your position thinks so. Then not everyone in my position is doing their job. She held his gaze for 3 seconds and longer than the conversation required. That's why I wanted breakfast to be normal. A beat. It wasn't. No. He kept his voice level. It was not. Someone laughed in the hallway outside. The sound broke something or restored it, he wasn't sure which. Vanessa stepped back from the doorway first. Go before Teresa starts timing us. She already is. Teresa, at the elevator, glanced up from her phone without being asked. 4 minutes and 42 seconds. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. Put it in my annual review. That Friday, the week ended and the building emptied in the particular way. Atlanta offices empty on Fridays gradually, then, all at once, with the quality of air pressure releasing. Anthony was working through a vendor escalation document at 6:15 when he heard his office door, and looked up, and Vanessa Carter was standing in it. She had shed the blazer at some point in the afternoon, cream blouse, the kind of quiet that sat differently than boardroom quiet. She closed the door halfway, not all the way, and he understood that exactly, understood the precision of half, and stood near the edge of his desk. Dinner. He set his pen down. That's a noun. Tonight. With me. That's a schedule. That's a risk. Her fingers tightened very slightly around the folder she was holding and then released. I was going to pretend this was about the enterprise rollout timeline. Is it? No. Good. He leaned back. Then I'm going to say something before either of us gets clever about it. Please. The word was dry, but there was something underneath it. I'm exhausted by clever. If we have dinner, it's not work. No agenda. No pretending we need to discuss a client. If it's a bad idea, we call it a bad idea now, and both of us behave like adults and move forward. If it's not a bad idea, then I pick the restaurant. She said it before he could. And no quarterly forecast discussion. Brutal. I have standards. He stood and reached for his jacket. 7:30. Something moved across her face. Not surprise. Closer to relief, which was its own kind of information. That fast. You came to my office on a Friday evening and said dinner like you were issuing a policy directive. I'm responding before you find a compliance document to hide behind. She looked at the floor for exactly 1 second, then back at him. Pick somewhere that doesn't know me. I know a place, of course you do. Don't sound suspicious. You own a disappointing lamp. Your taste is unverified. The lamp has been through a lot. It has character. It has failure. But the corner of her mouth was doing the thing again. The restaurant better not. He opened the door. Teresa was at her desk with her coat already on, bag over her shoulder, showing every sign of a woman who had planned to leave 10 minutes ago and had made a choice to stay. Have a good weekend, she said, looking at her screen. Vanessa pointed at her. Don't. I said weekend. Just weekend. Entirely normal. Standard. No implications weekend. She looked at Anthony over Vanessa's shoulder, something in her eyes that was equal parts warm and resigned and deeply, deeply unsurprised. Have a good one, Anthony. Seems unlikely, he said. No. Teresa stood and pulled on her coat. That's actually very likely. That's what I'm saying. The restaurant was in Inman Park, 20 minutes from downtown, by surface streets, in a neighborhood that had gone through several evolutions and landed somewhere that felt genuinely itself: old trees, brick fronts, the kind of foot traffic that meant people had specifically chosen to be in this particular place rather than being routed through it. The restaurant was small, well lit without being bright, and occupied by the kind of crowd that was paying attention to their own evenings. Anthony arrived early, because that was who he was. It wasn't anxiety, he had made peace long ago with the difference between the two. Arriving early was a form of preparation. He liked to understand a space before the space started asking things of him. Vanessa arrived exactly on time, because that was who she was. For the first 10 minutes they were both terrible at it. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at the menu longer than anyone who had already decided what they wanted needed to look at a menu. He drank water with the focus of a man who had been briefed that this was a very important beverage. The server asked about wine, and they both said no simultaneously, and then made the mistake of laughing too hard at a perfectly ordinary thing. And the laughter was too loud and a little desperate, and they both knew it. Vanessa put the menu down. This is ridiculous. Strong opening. I run a company with over 200 people. You coordinate 3 state field operations without losing anyone. We peaked at workplace competence. She laughed, the real one. The one that didn't check in advance, and after that the evening found its footing. They talked about normal things first. Her father, who had looked at a 12-year-old Vanessa across a conference table he was using as a dining room substitute and said, "This is how you read a balance sheet," because he believed the best gift he could give her was fluency in the language the world used to value things. Anthony's first job, 16 years old, loading trucks at a distribution center in Columbus, Ohio, 5 a.m. shifts, the specific cold of a Midwestern November before sunrise. The way work that used your body felt clarifying in a way he had never fully moved away from, even after his work became entirely different. Her hatred them with kindness. Hatred of corporate retreats. His suspicion that icebreaker games were specifically designed by people who had never been trapped in a room with accountants and didn't understand the damage they were capable of. "You're very opinionated for someone quiet," she said. "I'm not quiet. I'm selective." That sounds like something a quiet person puts on a motivational poster. "You manufacture motivational content now. We diversify." She asked why he'd never moved into senior leadership. Not aggressively, the way she asked questions when she was genuinely curious. With a directness that wasn't demanding, because it wasn't interested in performing the asking. He told her he liked building systems. He didn't like performing certainty for rooms that rewarded confidence over accuracy. He had watched too many people in leadership roles spend more energy defending decisions than making good ones, and he didn't have the specific kind of tolerance that required. She studied him. "That was oddly specific." "You asked." "I did." She set down her fork. "What about you asking me something? Do you like it? Being CEO?" She took a moment. Didn't perform the considering, actually considered. "Yeah. I like deciding. I like walking into something that's broken and knowing I can figure out where the break actually is, not just where it looks like it is." A pause. "I like that it was my father's and now it's mine. Not because I inherited it, because I learned it and then I earned it separately. Those are different things, they are. I don't like how much of it is theater." She said it quietly. Not performed disclosure, real admission. "The board wants me decisive but collegial. Confident but not intimidating. Available but never depleted. The list is long and the items contradict each other and nobody says that out loud. That sounds exhausting." "It is. Then why keep doing it?" She looked at him. "Because it's mine." 3 words. No speech attached. No qualification. Just ownership stated plainly. The way real things are stated when there's no performance required. Outside the restaurant afterward, neither of them moved toward their cars. Atlanta, at night, had the quality of a city that didn't completely stop. There was still movement, still light, the particular sound of a downtown neighborhood that had people in it rather than just infrastructure. She folded her arms in the moderate evening air and looked at the street. "This is the part where sensible people say goodnight. I've never fully trusted sensible people. You seem like their designated representative. That's a cover story." He looked at her. "Vanessa, I want to see you again." She didn't look away. "Good. Outside work. Good. And I don't want to do this halfway. I'm not interested in a version of this where we're sneaking around because we're embarrassed." Her expression shifted. Something careful came into it. "We have to be smart about it. The board already has opinions about how I run things. Harold Reed thinks my independence is a structural problem. Careful isn't the same as ashamed. Sometimes people use one to cover the other. I know. I'm not asking you to hang a sign. I'm asking you to not pretend this isn't what it is." She held that, turned it over. "I'm not ashamed of you. I didn't think you were. Good. And I won't make your position harder. That's not yours to decide alone." Something moved behind her eyes. The thing that happened when she encountered an argument she hadn't anticipated and recognized it as correct. "Say that again later. When you're tempted to go noble and disappear," he frowned. "That was specific. You're not difficult to read." "I'm very difficult to read, Anthony. You label your personal files by crisis level." He had no immediate response to that. "Can I kiss you?" she asked. And the directness of it was so complete and so characteristic of her. that it nearly knocked him off balance in a way no ambiguity could have. Yes. The kiss was careful at first, then less careful. Her hand rested against his chest for 1 second, not steadying, just present before she stepped back. She exhaled. Okay. He steadied himself. That was not a mistake. High praise. I'm working with what I have. Don't ruin it. I'm trying very hard not to. She smiled. Not the measured one. Not the CEO one. The one that apparently cost something, because she didn't spend it carelessly. Try harder. He drove home. The city moved past the windows of his truck with the particular quality of a night that had changed something, not dramatically. Not in any way that would be visible to anyone watching from the outside, but internally, in the place where a man keeps the accounting of what's true and what's no longer available to pretend isn't true. Something had shifted into a new position, and he understood that it wasn't going back. His apartment was exactly the same as he had left it. Same lamp, same clean surfaces, same carefully arranged life that asked nothing of him that he hadn't already prepared for. He stood in his kitchen with a glass of water and thought about a woman who said "it's mine" with 3 words and no apology, and thought about a version of himself that had spent years choosing the life he could handle over the life that might handle him, and thought about how those 2 things were now occupying the same space, and he was going to have to decide what to do with that. He didn't decide anything that night. He just stood in the kitchen for a while, in the light of the disappointing lamp, and let the accounting run. The next morning, Lorraine Mitchell found him before 9. No folder, no agenda visible. Would you treat them with kindness? Up by his desk with a coffee she hadn't offered to get him, and a look that was doing most of the communicating. You seen any unusual calendar blocks from the executive floor? No, why? She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was deciding how much to say and had landed on less than she knew. Just keep your eyes open. She walked away. Anthony watched her go. He had worked with Lorraine long enough to understand her communication style. She didn't visit people's desks to say nothing. She visited to say a specific something in the amount of space she could justify, and the rest of the message lived in the negative space around it. Something was moving on the executive floor, and whatever it was, it had been moving for longer than this week. Longer than a Friday evening dinner in Inman Park. Longer than an elevator ride on a night when the wrong set of eyes had been watching from the right angle. Harold Reed had smiled during the bet, had watched from across the room when Anthony named him most dangerous, and Vanessa laughed like she hadn't planned to. Had stood in the corner with his sparkling water, and his expensive calm and his very particular kind of attention. Anthony pulled up his vendor escalation document. Kept working. But he kept his eyes open. The calendar block appeared on a Tuesday. Governance Alignment Limited Distribution. 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Executive floor only. The kind of meeting that didn't include an agenda in the invite, because the people who sent it had already decided the agenda didn't require input from anyone who would be receiving it. Anthony saw it when he opened his laptop at 7:45. Not on his calendar. On the shared executive visibility panel that operations maintained access to for rollout coordination purposes. He wasn't supposed to act on information from that panel. He was supposed to use it for scheduling awareness. He looked at the block for a long moment. Then he looked at his inbox. Then he looked at the block again. Lorraine Mitchell appeared at his desk at 8:15. No coffee this time. Folder pressed tight against her side, the way she carried things when she had decided. The folder was a prop and the real information was verbal. You seen Vanessa this morning? Not yet. She's in with Harold. Board call, in person. Lorraine said those last 3 words with the specific economy of someone who understood exactly what they meant and was letting Anthony do his own math. In person meant the call had been arranged with enough advance planning to get board members into a building in Atlanta on a Tuesday before 9 a.m., which meant it had been arranged before last week, before the week before a lot of things that had happened between then and now. Anthony stood up. Lorraine's expression didn't move. She had the face of a woman who had already processed her own feelings about this information in private and arrived at his desk with only the professional layer showing. She looked at him steadily. Don't, she said quietly. He went anyway, not into the boardroom. He understood his position. He understood what walking through that door would cost and what it would accomplish, and the math didn't work. Would you treat them with kindness? But he walked to the corridor outside the executive suite on the 7th floor, past the glass-walled offices where early arriving directors were already moving with the particular energy of people who knew something was happening and had chosen not to be in the hallway for it. He stood outside and looked through the glass. Harold Reed sat at the head of the long table, not Vanessa's end, Harold's end, which meant he had arrived early enough to choose his position, which meant he had wanted this position specifically. 2 other board members flanked him, both of whom Anthony recognized from quarterly presentations. Gerald Whitmore, mid-60s, real estate background. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of board member who spoke only when he'd decided his silence had established enough authority to make the speaking worth something. And Diana Paulson, who had joined the Carter Analytics Board 18 months ago, under circumstances that had been described publicly as bringing fresh institutional perspective, and privately in operations, as Harold Reed recruited an ally. The 4th person at the table was a man Anthony didn't recognize. 50s, close-cut gray natural, wire-rimmed glasses, the bearing of someone whose entire professional identity had calcified into a single area of expertise. He had a bound document in front of him and was writing in it with the concentration of a man who believed documentation was the closest thing to power he would ever access. Governance consultant. The species was recognizable. They arrived when boards wanted to execute something and needed the structural legitimacy of an outside opinion that had already been purchased. Vanessa stood at the end of the table opposite Harold, not sitting, standing, with her hands flat on the table surface and her chin level, in the posture of someone who had walked into a room that had been set against her and had decided not to let that fact read on her body. Teresa appeared at Anthony's elbow so quietly that he felt her before he heard her. She'll end you if she sees you hovering. I'm not hovering. You are standing in a glass corridor staring through a window at a closed meeting. The technical term for that is hovering. I'm assessing. From the hallway. Different thing. Teresa stood beside him for a moment. She had her tablet against her chest, and her face had the quality it got when she was managing several things simultaneously and had prioritized stillness as a resource conservation strategy. They changed the agenda last night. Lorraine found out from the secondary distribution list. Limited packet. Vanessa didn't get the final version until 6 this morning. That landed. Anthony let it. Final governance packets went out 72 hours in advance, 60 at minimum. 6 hours was not a procedural variation. 6 hours was deliberate. How long have they been in there? 40 minutes. The door opened 23 minutes later. Harold Reed came out first. Late 50s, silver temples against dark skin, the kind of suit that communicated wealth through restraint rather than display. He walked with the unhurried pace of a man who had already arrived at his destination before he started moving. He saw Anthony in the corridor, and his expression rearranged itself into something that functioned like a smile, the way a mechanism functions technically correct, nothing warm powering it. Anthony. A pause the length of a small decision. Operations isn't involved in today's meeting. Good morning to you too, Harold. The smile got thinner, not angrier, just more precise. This moment requires discretion. Then maybe avoid glass rooms. Teresa made a sound beside him that she converted into a cough with professional speed. Harold's eyes moved to her, then back. Be careful. Usually am. Anthony kept his voice at the same register he used in budget reviews. Level. Not performing calm. Just calm. Because the alternative cost more than the situation warranted, and he wasn't going to spend it on Harold Reed in a hallway at 9 in the morning. What's happening to Vanessa? Miss Carter is transitioning certain responsibilities to allow greater focus on strategic shareholder engagement. Harold adjusted his cufflink with one hand. A gesture so practiced it had become invisible to him. She retains her ownership position, of course. 49%, Lorraine said from the far end of the corridor. She had arrived without announcement, standing near the elevator bay with a folder she wasn't opening. Her voice was perfectly even. She retains 49%. Harold glanced at her with the expression of a man cataloging a variable he hadn't factored. Yes. The other two board members came through the door behind Harold. Gerald Whitmore looked at Anthony once, and then at the floor. Diane Paulson looked at nothing in particular, which was its own kind of looking. The governance consultant followed them, documents still open already somewhere else in his attention. And then Vanessa came through the door. She was composed. That was the first word. And then a half-second later, the accurate word arrived. Too composed. The kind of composure that required constant maintenance, that burned fuel. That was the difference between a person who was fine and a person who had decided how they were going to look for the duration of the next however many minutes, and was executing that decision with everything they had. She saw Anthony. Something moved across her face, not surprise, because Vanessa Carter did not do surprised in public, but a recognition of his being there, of what it meant, of what she needed to do with it. Harold said Anthony with the tone of a man reasserting a direction. Anthony didn't look at him. He looked at Vanessa. "You okay?" Harold answered. "Miss Carter, as I asked her." The corridor was quiet for a beat. The specific quiet of a small space when the power in it shifts. Not dramatically, not with volume. Just in the way that happens when someone says the simple thing directly, and the simple thing turns out to be the sharpest object in the room. Vanessa met his eyes. "I'm fine." She wasn't. He knew what she looked like when she was fine. He had learned it in kitchens and restaurants and 442-second corridor conversations. This was what she looked like when she had decided how fine she was going to appear, and had committed to it completely. But she had asked him to respect the decision she was making in this specific room. He understood that. He honored it. He held Harold's peripheral gaze and kept his voice at the same conversational register, which was its own form of refusal to escalate. "I hope the board properly documented the operational exposure of a command transition during 3 active client rollouts. The Dallas integration is at a critical dependency stage. The Memphis vendor situation isn't resolved. Those timelines don't adjust for internal restructuring." Harold's smile returned, colder now and more itself. "We appreciate the perspective from operations." "No, you don't, but you'll need operations to manage client continuity while you handle the communication plan. So don't mistake my cooperation for endorsement of the process." Lorraine, at the far end of the hall, appeared to be studying something on her folder with great attention. Harold took one step closer. Not threatening. Establishing. "Return to your floor, Anthony. I'm going." He picked up his phone from his jacket pocket and looked at Harold with the expression of a man who had said exactly what he meant and had no additions. "One more thing, since we're in the same hallway. You should stop walking out of rooms with that particular expression on your face. It tells people things you probably want them not to know." Harold's expression went from calculated warmth to something flatter and more honest in the span of a single breath. Vanessa's voice arrived with the weight of a hand on his shoulder. "Anthony." One word. Not loud. Carrying a specific warning, and underneath it, something that might have been gratitude if gratitude and warning could occupy the same syllable, which apparently they could. He nodded once. Walked back toward the elevator. Didn't look back. Teresa caught up to him near the stairwell door. She didn't say anything. Just walked beside him, which was its own form of statement. The operations floor knew within an hour. Would you treat them with kindness? Companies ran on information, and the specific kind of information that lived in executive body language and altered schedules, and the way Lorraine Mitchell had walked from the elevator to her office without stopping to speak to anyone. That information moved fast, because people who worked in those buildings had spent years learning to read exactly those signals. It was a survival skill. You learned early that formal announcements were the last layer of a story that everyone else had already finished reading. Dennis from Product came by at 10 with the framing already assembled. The board had decided to pursue a more scalable leadership architecture to position Carter Analytics for its next growth phase. He delivered it with the smoothness of a man who had been given the language and believed that fluency in the language was the same as fluency in the meaning. He had chosen a side. He had done it quickly. That told Anthony something about Dennis that 5 years of budget arguments had never quite clarified. Cedric came into Anthony's office and closed the door at 10:30. He sat down in the chair across the desk, put his hands on his knees, and looked at Anthony with the specific expression he got when he had already cycled through jokes and arrived somewhere he didn't want to be. "Tell me, you didn't call Harold a fraud in the executive hallway." "I didn't call him a fraud." "What did you call him?" I suggested his expression was communicating more than he intended. Cedric processed this. "That's more diplomatic than I expected. I was having a restrained morning." "How bad is it?" "For real." Anthony looked at his screen. The vendor escalation document was still open from the morning. The Memphis timeline. The Dallas dependencies. 3 active rollouts that the board had just decided to execute a leadership transition across, without apparent concern for the operational implications, which meant either they had a plan and hadn't disclosed, or they were confident the operations team would absorb the damage without being asked to. It's bad. The timing is deliberate, and it's been building for months. Months. Cedric repeated the word carefully, the way you repeat something when you're letting the full weight of it settle. Like how many months? Long enough that it was already in motion before he stopped. Cedric looked at him. Before what? Before several things. Cedric was quiet for a moment. Then Anthony, listen to me very carefully, because I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to need you to actually hear it instead of just waiting for me to stop talking. He leaned forward. You did not cause this. A board with an agenda caused this. Harold Reed spent months building a coalition specifically because Vanessa Carter was making decisions he couldn't control, and the board structure gave him a mechanism to address that. That mechanism existed before you ate dinner in Inman Park. It existed before the rooftop party. It existed before any version of you and her that has developed in the last several weeks. Do you understand what I'm saying? Anthony looked at him. There's your face, Cedric said. Right there. That's the face I'm talking about. The one where you've already decided you're the weather event, and now you're just figuring out how to apologize for the flooding. I'm not. You absolutely are. I've known you 8 years. I can tell the difference between you thinking and you sentencing yourself and calling it thinking. He stood up. She is a grown woman who made her own choices about her life and her time and what she prioritized. They are grown people who constructed a legal mechanism to move against her. You had dinner with her 3 times. You are not that powerful. He left. The door closed behind him. Anthony sat with that. He sat with it through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, when Donald Thomas arrived. Donald Thomas made his presence known in the building before he made it known in person, which was a kind of pre-arrival competence that Anthony recognized as studied. Word came first interim CEO, effective immediately, background in financial services and organizational transformation, the board's confidence in his ability to steward the next phase. Then he appeared in the lobby at 1:15 with clean shoes that had never touched a job site, a handshake that had been engineered for maximum initial impact, and the baseline conviction of someone who had been installed rather than built. He called Anthony Tony in their first meeting. My name is Anthony. Right. Donald smiled with the warmth of a corporate training module on building rapport. We're all finding our footing here. Would you treat them with kindness? The meeting was framed as a listening session. Donald wanted to understand the operational landscape from the team leads before introducing any structural adjustments. He used the word adjustments 4 times in the first 20 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? Which told Anthony that adjustments was the vocabulary choice someone had made for him, and he was deploying it with the confidence of a man who hadn't yet noticed the tells. Also in the meeting, Lorraine, who was taking notes and whose face had achieved a level of professional stillness that looked carved. Gerald Whitmore on a video screen in the corner, and Harold Reed, also on video, in what appeared to be a very comfortable chair, in what appeared to be a very tasteful home office, smiling at intervals that corresponded to nothing being said and therefore corresponded to something being thought. Harold said, Anthony, these are the moments that separate resilient organizations from reactive ones. Agreed, Anthony said. Resilient organizations document their risk exposure before making significant structural changes mid-cycle. Happy to share the Dallas integration timeline if that would help. Donald's smile developed a slight structural issue. Harold's smile did not change, which was more concerning. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Donald's office sent Anthony the agenda segment breakdown. On Monday morning, a 20-minute operations update, with specific talking points provided. Anthony read the talking points, read them again. They were not operational information. They were operational, costuming, the shape of operational information, arranged to communicate that the transition was proceeding smoothly and the team was aligned and the company was steady in its new configuration. He printed the document, walked to Donald's office, set it on his desk. "No," he said. Donald looked up. "Good morning, Anthony." "No." Donald picked up the document. Read the first paragraph with the expression of a man double-checking that the paper said what he had originally thought it said. This is standard transition messaging. It's fiction. It's alignment. It's fiction in a better suit. Anthony stood with his hands at his sides, and his voice at the same register he had used with Harold in the hallway level. Direct, not performing anything. I will report operational facts, timeline status, client exposure risk, staffing numbers. I will not characterize a command change I don't believe in as a strength. Those are two different things. I'll do one of them. Donald set the paper down. His smile had reorganized into something more honest and less pleasant. I need team players. That's why I'm telling you before you put me on a stage and find out in front of 200 people. Would you treat them with kindness? On the video screen in the corner of Donald's office, permanently live for free, apparently, a choice that said a great deal about the nature of the interim arrangement. Harold Reed leaned slightly forward. Anthony. Mature organizations navigate transitions by maintaining consistent external messaging. Mature organizations also don't usually need to be told the messaging is false. You're an employee. I'm aware. He picked up his copy of the document. Facts only at the all-hands. That's what I'll deliver. If that's not acceptable, take my slot off the agenda. But don't schedule me to perform something I won't perform and expect the performance to happen. He set the document back on Donald's desk. Walked out. Would treat them with kindness. Teresa was near the elevator, her coat already on at 4:30 because Teresa operated on the principle that if the conversation had concluded she was already in the next chapter. She looked at him. I heard raised voices. You heard Donald encountering his first actual no. That must have been disorienting for him. He seemed to be managing. She pressed the elevator button. Vanessa asked about you yesterday. The elevator arrived. He held it. She could call. She knows. Teresa stepped in. I'm not delivering a message. I'm just saying, she asked. He walked back to his desk, pulled up his email, drafted a message to the Dallas client contact about the integration timeline, drafted a separate note to the Memphis vendor about the escalated dependency chain, drafted a third note to his regional staffing coordinator about the Southeast coverage gap. He did not draft a message to Vanessa. She called. At 8:40 that night, he had been home for an hour, at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup and a stack of vendor contracts he had brought home because the day had taken so much of the time he was supposed to spend on them. He looked at the phone for 2 full rings. Hey. Her voice was the careful version, the one that had structure to it. You doing okay? I'm fine. A pause, brief but weighted. Actually, can you come by? He drove to her house in Buckhead, through the specific quiet of a Tuesday evening, when Atlanta was past the dinner hour, and not yet at the late-night hour, and the streets had the texture of a city, resting between its own demands. Her neighborhood had the old-growth trees that the newer developments didn't, wide canopies over brick driveways, houses set back from the street, with the settled confidence of structures that had decided they were permanent. She opened the door before he reached the top step. No blazer. Dark slacks and a cream blouse, and her hair pulled back, which she only did when she had been inside all day, and the choice had stopped mattering. The mask was off. Not theatrically, she wasn't performing honesty any more than she had been performing composure. The composure was just genuinely gone, spent somewhere in the hours between the executive hallway and 8:40 p.m. He came in. She closed the door. "Tell me the truth," he said. "That's a rough opening. I can handle rough." She walked to the kitchen. He followed. Same island, same stools, same geography as the morning that had started everything, but the light was different. Evening light coming from under cabinet fixtures, and the room felt smaller in it. She poured water she didn't drink. "I keep my shares. 49%. The company isn't gone. I'm not devastated." The sentence constructed itself with visible effort, each part placed like something she had rehearsed. Maybe this is actually good. Maybe I needed the distance. Maybe I can finally. "That's not the truth." She turned. "I'm telling you, you're telling me the version you prepared for someone you don't fully trust yet." He kept his voice level. Not hard. Just honest, which sometimes looked the same from the outside. "That's not what I drove here for." The water glass sat on the counter untouched. She looked at him with eyes that had been doing something expensive all day and were running low on whatever resource doing that thing required. "You want me to perform devastation instead? I want you to stop performing altogether. You want me to collapse so you feel useful." She said it cleanly. Not cruelty, she wasn't being cruel. She was being precise in the way people get when they are genuinely exhausted, and precision is the only economy they have left. "That's not what I do." The sentence landed and he let it. He set his keys on the island very slowly. "The way you set something down, when you want the action to communicate that you're not leaving, not adjusting, not preparing to fill the silence with something more comfortable. No, I don't need you to fall apart, so I have a function. I've spent most of my adult life finding ways to be useful, so I didn't have to be present. I know exactly what that looks like, and that's not what this is." He let it rest there for a moment. "You had something taken from you today, by people who had months to plan it and chose a Tuesday morning with 6 hours of notice. You can be angry about that without it being weakness." Something shifted in her jaw. A tiny movement, controlled immediately. "Harold wanted this before you ever woke up in my guest room." "I know. Then stop standing there like you owe me the damage." "I'm not, you are." She came around the island, not quickly, not dramatically, just closing the space until the distance between them was a choice rather than a default. "I know what that face means. I've watched you organize your guilt for 2 weeks. Every time you thought I wasn't checking. You are not the reason they had votes. They had votes because Harold Reed decided 2 years ago that a woman who doesn't ask permission is a structural problem, and he spent 18 months building the legal path to address it. You had dinner with me 3 times. You are not the weather event." He stared at her. She looked away first, crossed her arms. Something behind her expression moved like a fault line. "I was scared," she said, quieter. Not small, her voice never went small. That wasn't one of her registers, but lower. Real. "I was scared you'd look at me without the title and do the math differently. That is insulting to both of us." "I know." She didn't uncross her arms. "I know that. I said it anyway. Vanessa, I didn't fall for the title. It complicated things. It also got you into quarterly strategy meetings, which were frequently terrible, and that had nothing to do with why I stood outside that glass corridor this morning." Something cracked through her composure. "Not all the way. Just a seam. I built that place," she said. "Not, I don't mean in the sentimental way people say that. I mean I came in at 26 and learned every system, and fixed what wasn't working and earned the chair separately from inheriting any part of it. I gave it years I didn't have spare. I missed things. I made choices about what mattered. And Harold Reed sat in a room with a governance consultant and described my father's company as an underperforming asset structure." Her voice had a new quality, now still controlled, but controlled the way a river is controlled by banks, and the pressure was visible. He used the word stewardship, like I'd been watching it for someone else. Anthony didn't say anything. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He understood that the silence was not absence, that staying in it without reaching for something to fill it was its own form of being present, and that it was harder than speaking, and that she needed it more than she needed him to be eloquent. "I don't know how to do this in front of someone," she said finally. "Not a confession exactly. An admission. The difference was in the framing confession implies wrongdoing, and she wasn't wrong. She was just human, and she had spent so long in rooms where human and CEO could not simultaneously be true that she had lost the practice of letting them coexist. Then practiced doing it badly. She looked at him. The seam in her composure widened by another degree. That's your romantic offer. It is. That's a terrible romantic offer. It's an honest one. A sound came out of her that was half a laugh and half something else and landed somewhere between them without resolving into either. She pressed one hand to her face for a moment, then lowered it. Her eyes were bright in the kitchen light. Not crying. Not yet. But close enough that the distance was a decision she was making in real time. I don't know what I am without it, she said. The sentence was smaller than her usual sentences. Had less architecture. I know that's not. I know it's not the thing I'm supposed to say. But I built my whole understanding of my own value inside that company, my father's company. And now I'm going to wake up tomorrow, and it's going to have Donald Thomas's name on the organizational chart and Harold Reed's fingerprints on the strategy documents, and I don't. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. He crossed the kitchen. He didn't say anything when he got to her. He didn't have a sentence ready, and he'd learned young enough that prepared sentences in unprepared moments were a form of distance, dressed up as comfort. He just put his hand on her shoulder, and she stood still for a moment, with the rigidity of someone who had been holding a structure in place for a long time and couldn't immediately remember how to stop. And then the structure came down. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Real pain doesn't arrive clean. It arrives in layers and reversals, and moments where it retreats and then returns stronger. And she cried and got angry and pulled back and came back and said something sharp that she immediately qualified, and then got angry at herself for qualifying. She said she hated this. He said that was reasonable. She said she hated that he was seeing it. He said he wasn't enjoying it either. She said that was a terrible thing to say. He said he was new at this. She laughed against his shoulder, a short and fractured thing, and then cried again. He held on. He kept his hands steady. He did not try to reframe anything or repackage anything, or offer her a version of the situation that was easier to stand in. He just stayed in the one that was real. At some point, the acute part passed the way acute things do, not by resolving, but by exhausting itself, running out of fuel, settling into something lower and more chronic that could be lived with rather than survived. She pulled back, didn't look at him immediately, pressed the back of her wrist to her eye with the expression of a woman who was annoyed at herself for the physical evidence of the last 20 minutes. I'm fine now. You don't have to be fine now. I'm choosing to be fine now. There's a difference. There is. He didn't push on it. Okay. She exhaled, leaned against the counter, looked at him with the residue of everything she just moved through, still visible in the quality of her face, and underneath it, something new, something that had been hidden behind the composure and was only visible now that the composure had a gap in it. I really didn't want to lose you too, she said. Quiet. The quietest thing she'd said all evening. Would you treat them with kindness? He understood the weight of that sentence, not just the literal meaning, but the architecture underneath it, the whole history of what it cost her to say it, the years of maintaining rooms rather than entering them. Would you treat them with kindness? The particular discipline of a woman who had learned early that admitting what you wanted gave other people a target. Then don't protect me by shutting me out, he said. I'm not something to be managed. She held that. A long moment. I'll call tomorrow. If you don't answer first, I'll call once, not 15 times. I'm persistent, not unhinged. There's a difference. Something that might have been a real smile, small and tired and genuine, moved across her face. You should go. I should. He picked up his keys. At the door he paused, because something required being said, and he had learned that the doorway was where honest things went when they didn't fit inside the room. You're still yourself, he said. Everything that made the company functional, that's yours. It goes where you go. Harold Reed can put whoever he wants in the chair. He can't invoice himself for the work you actually did. She didn't answer immediately, but she held the door without closing it, and that was its own kind of answer. He drove home. Atlanta's lights moved past in the particular way of a city that keeps running regardless of what you've been through, which was either cruel or reassuring depending on the night, and tonight he found it close to the latter. The world continuing was not indifference. It was just scale. Everything he and Vanessa were carrying was real and important and happening inside a city that was also real and important and happening, and both of those things could be true. The following 2 weeks were their own particular punishment. Donald Thomas consolidated his position in the building with the speed of a man who had learned that presence was its own form of authority, and that authority required reinforcement through visibility. He held department stand-ups. Would you treat them with kindness? He introduced a bi-weekly leadership alignment check-in that required 3 department heads to provide status reports they had already been providing in the weekly written update, which meant the same with kindness, which meant the same information was now being processed, twice in 2 different formats for the benefit of someone who apparently processed information better when it was being performed than when it was being documented. He renamed the operations floor layout, not the work the layout. The sections were now called deliveries, were now called delivery zones, which was a phrase that had originated in logistics and had no meaningful application to a data consulting firm, and communicated to anyone who had been in the building long enough that the person who had with kindness, the person who had introduced the phrase, had learned about operations from a presentation rather than from operations. He assigned Anthony a project coordinator who was 27 years old and had 6 months of experience at a mid-size marketing firm, and had apparently been selected on the basis of willingness rather than knowledge. The coordinator was named Price and was genuinely eager in the specific way that made experienced people simultaneously sad and cautious, because eagerness in the wrong direction was often worse than nothing. "I want to help," Price said, on his first day at the desk adjacent to Anthony's. "I know you do," Anthony said. "Donald said you needed support on the Dallas rollout. Donald has been here 9 days." Price absorbed this. "Is there somewhere I should start?" Anthony looked at him. He wasn't the enemy. He was just a 27-year-old who had been assigned to a situation he hadn't been briefed on accurately. "Read every dependency document from the last 3 months. Don't skip anything. Come back when you've finished and tell me what you think the core risk is. Don't tell me what the documents say. Tell me what you think." It was the same instruction he had been given by someone else, years ago, in Columbus, at the end of a long day at the distribution center, when his supervisor had handed him a clipboard and said, "Don't count what's on it. Understand why that number is what it is." The instruction that separated processing from thinking. Price took the documents and went to a corner and did not speak for 4 hours, which was the best possible outcome. Lorraine appeared at Anthony's desk on Thursday of that same week. This time she had coffee 2 cups. She set one in front of him and sat in the chair across the desk without being invited, which meant the information was significant enough to override the formality. "They're going to move you," she said. He looked up. "What?" "Memphis. The regional office." Donald proposed it to Harold as a way to stabilize the Atlanta floor by removing what they called a friction point. Harold approved it. "The official communication is being drafted. The floor treat them with kindness." The floor shifted in a way that didn't show on his face because he had practice with this, with the moment when the situation recalibrates, and you have to absorb the new information before you can respond to it intelligently. "Memphis." He said the word to see what it felt like. It felt like a maneuver. "Who knows?" "Teresa." She heard the call. "She told me." Lorraine wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "End of month unless something changes." What would change it? Giving them a reason to move faster. Or she looked at him steadily, in the way she looked at things she had already decided about and was now presenting for someone else's decision. Or not being here to move. That night, Anthony came home to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table with the resignation letter open on his laptop. He had written the first draft 5 days ago in 20 minutes, which was how he knew it was real. The things that came quickly were usually the things that had been true for longer than he'd acknowledged. He had opened it every day since. Read it, closed it. He opened it now. The lamp threw its usual inadequate light across the table. The apartment was quiet with the specific quality of a space that had been organized by someone who had very precise ideas about what they needed and not much idea of what they wanted. Every choice in the room had been functional, correct. The kind of correct that added up to a life with no sharp edges and nowhere for anything unexpected to get purchase. He thought about 5 years of operational work that had held client relationships through system failures and vendor crises and personnel transitions. He thought about 3 active rollouts that were currently being overseen by a man who had renamed his desk layout and assigned him a 27-year-old from a marketing firm. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about walking past the 7th floor every morning and feeling himself becoming the kind of person who knew the true version of things and chose the comfortable position anyway. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about a woman sitting on her kitchen floor at 10 p.m. because she had finally stopped holding the structure up, and what it had cost her to stop, and what it said about her that she had held it as long as she had. He was not signing this letter for her. He needed to be clear about that. Not as a performance of courage. Not as a sacrifice he could gesture at later. Not because he thought resignation would give her anything back. She was not a reason. She was a consequence of a cleaner truth. A cleaner truth. He had been lending his competence to people who had used due process as a weapon and called it governance, and every day he continued doing it. He was ratifying the transaction. He signed the letter. He went to sleep. In the morning, he walked into Donald Thomas's office at 8:15 and placed the resignation letter on his desk. Donald looked at it. Read the first 3 lines. Set it down. You're serious? Yes. This is Anthony. This is an emotional decision. It's a clear one. Those aren't the same thing. No, but this one happens to be both. Donald stood up, moving into the space of the conversation with the physical energy of a man who had been trained that presence conveyed authority and was deploying it. The company needs operational stability right now. You're one of the people who provides that. Leaving during a transition period, you created the transition period. The board made a structural decision. The board executed a plan they built over 18 months to remove a CEO who was making decisions they couldn't control. I understand what happened. I was in the hallway for part of it. Anthony picked up his copy of the letter from the desk, the duplicate he had printed at 6 that morning, and held it at his side. I stayed because I thought there might be a version of this, where I could do useful work inside a changed situation. I stayed until this week. This week I understood there wasn't. Donald looked at him with the expression of a man trying to find the lever. This won't bring her back. I know. Then what does this accomplish? Anthony thought about the question. He gave it the time it deserved, which was a few honest seconds, not a performed pause. It tells me something about who I work for. He moved toward the door. Forward my final pay to the direct deposit on file. Harold Reed called him 20 minutes later. Anthony was at his desk, clearing his desktop methodical, one section at a time, the way he did everything. He answered. Anthony. Harold's voice had its usual quality, smooth, measured, the sound of a man who had learned that control was its own form of warmth. I hope you've taken time to consider whether this is the appropriate response to a business decision. I have. You have exceptional operational instincts. Carter Analytics has benefited from your work considerably. I know. I'd hate to see those instincts removed from an environment that uses them well. Anthony stopped what he was doing. Looked at the wall above his monitor for a moment, the clean expanse of it, the complete absence of decoration, which he had always thought of as intentional clarity and was now reconsidering. Harold, you built a legal mechanism to remove a CEO because she was too good at making decisions without your permission. You did it cleanly and patiently and with full documentation. I genuinely respect the craft of it, even though what it was used for is something I can't work inside of. He paused. I hope you know what you're keeping. A brief silence. Then Harold, measured. I hope you know what you're giving up. I do. He picked up his stapler and put it in the box. Do you? He hung up. Lorraine appeared in his doorway, with her arms folded, and her expression set to the particular configuration she used when she had an opinion she was going to state regardless of whether it was welcome. Idiot. Good to see you too. You could have waited. I waited long enough to be sure I wasn't doing it for applause. She walked in. Shut the door. Would you treat them with kindness? Stood across from the desk and looked at the half-full box with the expression of a woman who was sad about something and had decided the sadness was not going to stop her from the next sentence. For what it's worth, she said. You're right. He looked up. She held his gaze. Don't make me say it again. He put a framed operations map into the box. Keep the Dallas timeline honest. I'll keep the clients breathing. The souls of men are outside my jurisdiction. Cedric arrived carrying Anthony's coffee mug, with the solemnity of someone conducting a ceremony. He had clearly been waiting in the hallway for Lorraine to leave, which was thoughtful in the specific way Cedric was thoughtful when he tried. You forgot this. I hadn't left yet. I was pacing my arrival. He set the mug on the edge of the box with care. You have a plan. Not a complete one. That's new. I'm trying it. Cedric looked at the room, at the cleared desk, at 5 years of operational work reduced to the contents of one banker's box and a mug with a Carter Analytics logo that Anthony was going to replace at the earliest reasonable opportunity. For what it's worth, he said, this is the dumbest brave thing I've watched in a while. Put that on my reference. I'm putting it on mine. As a witness. He held the door open. Go say what you actually need to say to the person you actually need to say it to. Anthony picked up the box, took one last look at the room, the good light from the east window, which he had liked every morning for 5 years, without specifically noticing it until now, when it was the last time. The clean walls. The operational map Lorraine had helped him build in the 2nd year. Before it became a standard document, back when it was a working argument for why the department's timeline model was structurally more accurate than the one finance preferred. Good work. Real work. The kind that didn't need acknowledgement to have been worth doing. He walked out. She opened the door before he reached the top step, which meant she had been watching for him. Or she had heard the truck. Or she had been standing near the window for reasons she would never describe as waiting. Because Vanessa Carter was waiting, because Vanessa Carter did not wait, she positioned herself strategically, which was an entirely different thing, and they both understood that. She looked at the box in his arms, looked at his face, looked at the box again. What did you do? Not a question. The inflection of a woman who already knew and was giving him the opportunity to say it in a way that was his rather than hers. I brought my mug. Anthony. I resigned. Something moved across her face and went still. Gone so fast he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching specifically for the moment when her composure received information it hadn't been braced for. No. Yes. No, you. She stepped back from the door. Come in. He came in. Set the box on the floor near the entryway, next to the Boston fern that had been living its unbothered life through all of this. The house was warm with kindness. The house was warm and quiet and smelled like the tea she made in the evenings when she was working through something, a particular blend she kept in the cabinet above the kettle, dark and slightly bitter, that she had described once as the flavor of not being done yet. She was already in motion. Not pacing. Vanessa didn't pace. That was too legible, but moving. Circling the kitchen island with the contained energy of someone who had decided to stay in her body rather than let the emotion run it. She filled the kettle. Turned it on. Put her hands flat on the counter. I don't need you to sacrifice your career for me. I didn't, Anthony. You left a job you built over 5 years, without another position lined up, because I couldn't keep doing the work inside a structure that used process as a weapon and called it governance. That's not a sacrifice. That's a preference. He stood near the island. Not sitting. Not adjusting his position to make the conversation easier. Those are different things. You're splitting a very thin hair. The hair is load-bearing. Do not talk to me like I'm one of your project coordinators. I'm talking to you like the woman I love, who is about to convert her fear into anger because anger has better posture. The sentence landed. He felt it land. No taking it back. No softer version available in any adjacent sentence. That's not a criticism. I understand the impulse. I'm just not going to pretend I don't see it. The kettle hadn't boiled yet. The kitchen was very quiet. Vanessa turned around. Her arms crossed, not closed off, contained, which was different. Her eyes had the brightness of a woman who was running high on something she hadn't yet named. You love me. Yes, you said that very casually. I've known it for a while. I was being disciplined about the timing. That's she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again, that puts pressure on me. I know. You said you know, but you made a unilateral decision that changes the architecture of both our lives without. It changes mine, he said. Steady. Not harsh. The way you correct a calculation when the error matters. You decide what it means for yours. Those aren't the same action, and I'm not conflating them. She held that. He watched her hold it, watched the argument she was building. Encounter the argument he had just made, and have to root around it, because she was precise enough to recognize when a correction was accurate, even when it arrived at the worst possible moment. You quit your job, she said finally, quieter. I did. Without talking to me first. Yes. Do you hear the problem in that? I hear several things in that. He moved to the stool at the island, sat down, which changed the geometry of the conversation, brought it out of the standing confrontation register and into something lower and more honest. I hear that you're scared. I hear that you're angry. I hear that the anger is real and the fear is realer. And I hear you trying to find the version of this that you can manage, which is what you do when something matters more than you want to admit. A beat. I'm not a crisis you can manage. The kettle started its sound. She didn't turn to it. I lost my company, she said. I know. No. Her voice had a new quality now, not louder, but denser. The way a room gets denser when the windows close. You know the outline. You know the facts I told you, and the facts you observed from a hallway. You don't know what it felt like to sit across from Harold Reed while he talked about my father's company the way a bank talks about collateral. You don't know what it costs to stand in that room and not let him see it cost you anything. You don't know what I drove home thinking about. He didn't say anything. Because she was right, and because the correct response to being right was space, not supplemental information. He had learned that in the last several weeks, slowly, with more mistakes along the way than he liked to account for. But he had learned it. I gave that place everything that wasn't nailed down, she continued. The density in her voice had shifted into something rawer. Not performed, she was past performing by now, past the composure and past the anger, and into the layer underneath both, which was the place where the real accounting happened. I missed things I can't get back. I made choices that I told myself were investments in something I was building. And then Harold Reed spent 18 months finding a clause in a shareholder agreement my father signed before I was running the company. And he used it, and now it's Donald Thomas's name on the org chart, and I am. She stopped. Her jaw shifted. The way it did when she was holding something in that wanted to come out sideways. I told you I was relieved, she said. I told you that because I couldn't stand the idea of you looking at me with the specific pity people use when someone loses something they built with their own hands. Like the thing was me, and without it I'm a reduced version. Her eyes found his. I never saw you look at me that way, but I was terrified you would. I never saw you reduced, he said. I saw you hurt. Those are not the same category. Hurt is worse. Hurt is human. She shook her head. Not disagreement, refusal, which was different. I don't know how to be human at someone while they're watching. I know how to be functional. I know how to be effective. I know how to run a room and hold a strategy and make decisions in front of people who are looking for a reason to doubt them. I don't know how to pause. I don't know how to let something be bad in front of someone I care about without it feeling like a failure. Then practice it badly, he said. Right now. With me. Start anywhere. She laughed. It was short and fractured and came out of nowhere, which was how the real ones arrived. And then it became something else, not tears exactly, or not yet. But the thing that is adjacent to tears when you have been holding a structure in place for weeks and the structure has just encountered something that doesn't require it. Her hand came up to her face, then came down. I hate this, she said. I know. I hate that you're seeing it. You said that before. In your kitchen the night after it happened, you said that. He stood up from the stool and came around the island, not quickly, giving her the space to register his movement and decide what she wanted to do with it. I'm still here. The thing you were afraid would happen when you let me see it, I'm still here. Update your model. She looked at him. The brightness in her eyes had resolved into something that was going to require her to make a decision in the next 30 seconds about whether she was going to manage it or let it be. She let it be, not gracefully. Because real things rarely arrive gracefully, they arrive the way they arrive, at the wrong time and in the wrong light and with no soundtrack to signal that this is the important part. Pay attention. She cried, and got angry at herself for crying, and said something cutting that she immediately apologized for, and then got angry at herself for apologizing. She pulled back twice and came back twice, and at one point said Harold Reed's name, in a sentence that would have genuinely impressed Anthony's grandmother in terms of vocabulary and creativity. He held on, kept his hands steady, did not try to compress the timeline or redirect the feeling towards something more manageable. He stayed in it with her, because she had asked him to stay, not in those words, not out loud, but she would treat them with kindness. But she had called him at 8:40, and she had opened the door before he reached the step, and those were words in the language people speak when they don't know how to ask for what they need directly. The acute part passed. The way it always does, not because the thing that caused it became less true, but because the body has a limit on what it can sustain at full intensity, and eventually it steps back from the edge and lets you breathe. She pulled away, didn't look at him immediately, pressed the heel of her hand to her eye. "I'm fine. You're allowed to not be fine for another few minutes. I used my allotment." "There's no allotment. In my experience," she stopped, almost smiled. "Never mind. They ended up on the floor. Not by design. There wasn't a moment when either of them decided this. It just happened the way these things happen when two people have been in an intense conversation for a long time, and the furniture starts to feel like a formal commitment neither of them is ready to make. The sofa was behind them. The coffee table was in front of them. His copy of the resignation letter was on the coffee table. She had seen it when he came in and hadn't commented on it yet. She looked at it now. "I love you too," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the coffee table. Her hair had come partially loose from where she'd pulled it back. Her tea was still in the kitchen, unmade. "Don't make me repeat it immediately. I'm still annoyed with you. I would never." "You absolutely would." "I absolutely would," he confirmed, "but I'll wait until tomorrow." She turned her hand over, palm up, between them. He put his hand in it. "What now?" she said. Not helplessly, not searching, just asking, the way you ask when the emergency has passed and the ordinary has not yet arrived and there's a space between them that needs to be acknowledged before it can be filled. Now we don't try to solve tomorrow tonight. That's mature and irritating. Most useful things are. Did someone smart say that? Lorraine, approximately. In her own words, the version was better. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Of course it was. This time the laugh was more itself. Small and tired and real. And it filled the space between them in the way that mattered, not resolving the situation. Because the situation was not resolved and wouldn't be for a while, but making the space livable. Which was what treat them with kindness. Which was what she had asked him for in different ways across different rooms every time she had let him close enough to ask anything at all. He drove home at midnight. Atlanta at that hour had the texture of a city, between identities, the nightlife still moving in pockets, the professional infrastructure at rest, the whole apparatus breathing in the dark, in a way it couldn't afford to during the hours when it was expected to perform. He knew this city, in the way you know a place after years of early mornings and late evenings inside it. The particular light at the Piedmont Park corner. The way the expressway interchange sounded at low traffic hours. The neighborhoods that stayed awake versus the ones that went dark by 10. He parked in his garage and sat in the truck for a moment before going up. The resignation letter was still in his jacket pocket, the original, the one with the actual signature, the one that had been on Donald Thomas's desk for approximately 4 hours before it was presumably filed somewhere in the HR infrastructure of a company Anthony no longer worked for. That was a strange thing to know about a piece of paper, that it had crossed a threshold and could not be recalled. He was unemployed for the first time since he was 22 years old. Good, he thought, and meant it. The first, treat them with kindness. The first month was an education in the difference between what you expect financial uncertainty to feel like, and what it actually feels like. He had savings, he had always had savings, because he was the kind of person who treated financial preparation as a form of self-respect. But savings that were designed to be a buffer felt different when they became the primary income source. Would you treat them with kindness? Different in the specific way that made him check the account balance more carefully than he had in years, think more deliberately about the consulting rates he quoted, and understand in a practical, rather than theoretical way, why people made compromises they wouldn't otherwise make when the ground felt less solid. The first contract didn't come in the first week. It came at the end of the second week, through a referral from a former Carter Analytics vendor contact, who had watched Anthony handle 3 consecutive crises without losing a client and had remembered that. A small logistics company in Alpharetta that needed someone to explain why their operational model was losing time they couldn't account for. He told them the cause in 2 days. They found this alarming. He spent 3 more weeks helping them fix it. They found this reassuring. The second contract took another 2 weeks. After that, a mid-size healthcare staffing firm in Decatur that had been trying for 8 months to reconcile their scheduling system with their billing system, without understanding why the reconciliation kept producing numbers that looked plausible but were wrong. He identified the source on the 3rd day. A mapping error baked in at integration, compounding quietly for 8 months because the outputs it produced were wrong in a direction that felt like rounding rather than structural failure. He fixed it in a week. The firm's operations director, a woman named Shirley, who had developed workarounds for every symptom, without anyone believing her that the root problem existed, looked at the corrected output and said, "I knew something was wrong. Nobody believed me." People with broken systems usually know, Anthony said. They just can't always locate the break precisely enough to make other people see it. She looked at him steadily. "You available beyond this engagement? Talk to me in 6 weeks. Let me see how this holds first." The contracts paid. Not Carter Analytics level compensation. Not at that point. Not on his own, but enough to cover the functional distance between savings and necessity. And they came with a quality of ownership that employment had never quite provided. The accountability was his. The results were his. So was the credit, which he had spent 5 years distributing to the departments and directors and quarterly reports, without much thought about what it meant to keep some of it. Vanessa was moving through her own version of the same terrain. She started receiving calls in the 4th week. Not from the people she had always known. Those calls had been arriving since the day after the board vote, with condolences and opportunities, and the specific brand of networking that presents itself as support, while primarily serving the needs of the person offering it. The calls that meant kindness. The calls that meant something were from people who had wanted to work with her for years but had found the CEO structure too complex to navigate board accountability, shareholder dynamics, a company infrastructure that made every outside engagement feel like a procurement process. Now she was simply Vanessa Carter, which turned out to be substantial on its own terms. A real estate investment group in Buckhead wanted to understand why their portfolio assets were underperforming their models. A healthcare network in Midtown had operational data and financial data that kept disagreeing, and no one who could explain why. A manufacturing company in Marietta wanted someone to tell them whether their supply chain assumptions were actually accurate or just familiar enough to feel safe. She took the calls, assessed the situations, delivered the kind of analysis that had always been her specific gift, not just identifying where the problem was, but mapping what the problem was built on top of, which was usually the more actionable information. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Would you treat them with kindness? The difference now was that the goodness arrived without the 30% overhead of board management and governance theater, written by people who had found her competence inconvenient. They saw each other through those weeks with a frequency that reflected reality rather than design. Some weeks, multiple times dinner at her house or his apartment. One Saturday afternoon walking the Beltline Trail when Atlanta showed itself at its most plainly itself. Would you treat them with kindness? the light on the old brick buildings along the corridor turning amber in the late afternoon, in a way that made the city look like it was holding something it hasn't decided whether to keep. Some weeks once, or briefly, because two people simultaneously building different new things out of the materials of the same collapsed structure required more bandwidth than every day provided, they argued. This was new and not new. They had disagreed in meetings and strategy sessions for years, in spaces where the frame of the professional context bounded and clarified the disagreement. Personal arguments had no such frame. The stakes were different. The techniques that worked in conference rooms did not transfer cleanly to kitchen tables, and the learning curve was real and occasionally uncomfortable. The hardest argument was on a Thursday in the 6th week. She had been carrying something since he arrived, not directed at him, not specific, just a generalized sharpness that told him something was sitting wrong and hadn't found its location yet. He let it run for an hour, until she made a dismissive remark about a client situation he was navigating, and he set his forecourt down. You can be frustrated about something without transferring it to me. I'm not. You've been edged since I walked in. I'm not the source. What's the actual problem? She looked at him with the expression she used when she was annoyed at being read accurately, which was a specific and distinctive expression. I drove past Carter Analytics today. He waited. I wasn't planning to. I was coming back from Midtown and the route went by and She stopped, reorganized. They changed the sign, new font. Different logo. It's a small thing. It's not a small thing. It shouldn't feel as large as it does. It was your father's, and then it was yours, and now it has a different font on the front. That's allowed to feel large. He picked his fork back up. Don't compress your own grief to make it more manageable, and then be surprised when it comes out sideways at someone who didn't put the new sign up. She was quiet for a moment. The sharpness in the room moved. I snapped at you. You did. I don't want to do that. Then when you do, name it. I can handle the real version. It's the packaged version that creates actual distance. She filed this, slowly, with the expression of someone choosing from the correct folder rather than the convenient one. You're better at this than I expected. I've been practicing. On who? Myself, mostly. I have extensive experience being the central problem in my own life. She almost laughed. They finished dinner. Would you treat them with kindness? The sharpness in the room resolved into something that could be sat with rather than navigated around. His difficult weeks arrived with a different character. Not grief the way she experienced it. He had been formed at Carter Analytics, not completed there, and the distinction mattered in ways he was still mapping. What he missed was scale, the size of the problems. The consulting contracts were real, and the work was good, and the clients were grateful, but they were narrowly scoped by necessity. And there were afternoons scoped by necessity, and there were afternoons when he finished a call and sat for 10 minutes feeling the specific satisfaction of a person using 70% of their capacity and aware of the remaining 30% going unused. Vanessa noticed this the way she noticed most things before he had named it, from the quality of his silence after conversations when a thought hadn't finished. What? She said one evening, without looking up from her laptop. Nothing. You've been thinking at that wall for 6 minutes. I think efficiently. You think loudly. Different thing. She closed the laptop. Say what's actually there. I miss the scale of it, he said. Not Carter Analytics. The problem size, the complexity. She looked at him without judgment and without filling the space immediately. I know. It'll come, it will. A pause. What if we made it come faster? He looked at her. She opened the laptop and turned it toward him. A spreadsheet, treat them with kindness? A spreadsheet she had clearly been building for a while. The logic was layered rather than assembled in a single session. The way things look when someone has been returning to them over time and adding rather than drafting all at once. Client data on one axis. Service capability on the other. Revenue projections built on conservative assumptions and then stress-tested against 3 different market scenarios. He looked at it for a long time. Would you treat them with kindness? Long enough to understand what it was, what she was proposing, and what the implications of that proposal were, not just financially, which were real and significant, but structurally and personally, and in terms of what it would mean for both of them to attempt something like this together. Equal, he said. Equity equal. Decision rights equal. Final say. We argue until one of us is demonstrably correct. That could take a very long time. I've built the timeline for it. She pulled the laptop back. The model works at current rate with one mid-market client per quarter. It works considerably better with 2. And it creates the problem scale you're looking for within 18 months if we're disciplined about client selection. We'd need an office. I've been looking. You've been building this for a while. I've been thinking about it for a while. She closed the laptop. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. I didn't build the actual spreadsheet until I knew you'd be in it. He sat with that. Let it settle all the way down before he responded to it. You should have led with that. I know. I led with the numbers because the numbers are easier. For you. For me. She looked at him directly. We don't hide inside the work. That's a condition. That's going to be the hardest one. I know. That's why it's first. He stayed the night. Would you treat them with kindness? Not for the first time the geography between his apartment and her house had been blurring gradually over the previous weeks, in the way that happens when two people keep arriving at the same place and start leaving things. His charger on her kitchen counter, her reading glasses on his coffee table. The material facts of two lives overlapping accumulate before either person has made a formal decision about them, and those facts have their own momentum. In the morning, she was up before him. Would you treat them with kindness? He heard the kitchen, the specific sequence of sounds her morning had, which he had catalogued to the point where he could identify the kettle versus the coffee maker and know approximately where in the sequence she was. He lay still for a few minutes just listening to it. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was not something he had done in the years before this. Which was not something the version of himself who had organized his life around containing its own perimeter would have understood the value of. He got up, went to the kitchen. She was at the counter with coffee, her hair loose, wearing his old sweatshirt, not because she'd asked and he'd offered. Would you treat them with kindness? It had become one of those material facts that simply existed now, and reading something on her phone with the focused expression of someone who had already been working for an hour and reached a paragraph requiring more attention than the others. She looked up. Good morning, honey. He pointed at her. That phrase has legal implications. No legal talk before 8. What time is it? 7:52. Then no legal talk in 8 minutes. She handed him the coffee she had already made for him, which meant she had heard him get up before he reached the kitchen, which meant she had been tracking the sounds the way he had been tracking hers. You have a call at 9, she said. We have a call at 9, equal partners. Unfortunately, her mouth curved. Such a hardship. Would you treat them with kindness? He leaned against the counter and looked at her. This specific version of her, the one that existed in the mornings before the day had asked her to be anything in particular. The one that wore his sweatshirt and made 2 coffees and didn't manage her expression because there was no one here who required managing. This was the version he had caught the first glimpse of in a different kitchen a year ago, standing at a counter with a mug in both hands and a quality of ease that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with being genuinely herself when no one needed anything from her. Except he had been there, and she had let him see it anyway. That morning, the houseplant, the burnt toast, the one sock had not ruined anything, had not created the problem, or revealed the flaw, or introduced the complication he had spent years preemptively guarding against. It had just shown him something true before he'd had time to protect himself from knowing it, which was in retrospect exactly what he had needed. The company launched 6 months after the spreadsheet conversation. They found office space in Nashville's 2nd floor, above a dental practice, which they had not planned for, and which produced the specific absurdity of conducting client calls, while someone's appointment below provided unexpected acoustic accompaniment. The office was smaller than they'd initially projected, cleaner. Theirs in a way that Carter Analytics had been Vanessa's and no space had been Anthony's, because ownership is different from occupation. And he hadn't understood the full weight of that distinction until he was standing in a room that belonged to both of them and feeling it. The company name was the last decision. They had circled the last decision. They had circled it for weeks because naming a thing is also a form of defining it, and they had strong and not always compatible opinions about what they were building. Would you treat them with kindness? They landed on something that described the actual work, finding the places where organizations were working against themselves and making those places visible before the damage became irreversible. They called it groundwork consulting, because everything that mattered had to be built from the bottom. Teresa Coleman arrived 3 months after the launch. She appeared at the office door on a Tuesday morning with a tote bag and an expression of composed inevitability, like she had looked up the address the week after Anthony resigned and had been running out a predetermined timer ever since. This place needs someone who knows what they're doing, she said. Vanessa, you're 3 months late. I was finishing something. You were waiting to see if we were serious. I was waiting to see if you were viable. Teresa looked around the office, the second desks they had just added. The whiteboard, with the Marietta supply chain map still visible from Friday's client session. The coffee situation, which was functional rather than aspirational. You're viable. High praise. It's accurate. I don't offer praise before viability is established. She set her tote bag down on the nearest empty desk with the finality of someone planting a flag. Also, the lamp needs to go. Anthony looked up from his laptop. Excuse me. The lamp in the corner. It's inadequate. That lamp has been with me for 3 years. That lamp has been failing you for 3 years. Those are different relationships. Teresa sat down, opened her laptop. I'll order a replacement this afternoon. You can't just Anthony. Vanessa, at her desk across the room, without looking up. Let her order the lamp. It's a matter of our company, Vanessa said, still not looking up. That means 3 of us have opinions about the lamp. 2 against 1 is not a process. It's democracy. Teresa was already typing. You've been outvoted. Welcome to equal partnership. He looked at the lamp. The lamp had no feelings about this, and therefore no useful contribution to make. Fine, he said, but I reserve the right to evaluate the replacement. Noted, Teresa said. Overruled. Lorraine Mitchell sent them their first significant client referral in the 4th month. A regional banking group, serving the Mid-South market, that was trying to understand why their operational model was losing accuracy at scale. The kind of problem that looked like a data problem, but was actually a structural assumption problem, which meant the data team had been looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place and getting correctly wrong answers. Anthony drove to Memphis twice in 1 week. Would you treat them with kindness? Came back with detailed notes and a clear picture of where the breakdown was occurring and why it was occurring at that specific point rather than somewhere the organization would have noticed sooner. He presented the findings on a Thursday. Walked through the analysis without performing certainty he hadn't earned. He had it, which was different. And the difference showed in the quality of the stillness when he finished and waited. The client's CFO, a man named Victor Bryant, who had survived many consultant presentations and arrived at each new one with the calibrated skepticism of someone who had been told things that later proved untrue, looked at the findings for a long time. Then he looked at his team, then back. How long would it take to fix? 8 to 12 weeks for the structural correction. Another 4 to validate. The full picture won't be clean until month 6. You'd want to stay involved through the full process. That's your call. We can hand off after the structural correction. Can't? I'd recommend staying through validation because that's usually where the second layer becomes visible. Victor looked at his team again. Made a decision in the particular way. That people who are good at decisions make them without performing the process of making them. When can you start? The contract was significant. Not Carter Analytics scale. And groundwork was not trying to be Carter Analytics, that was its own form of clarity about what they were building and why. But significant enough to change the model from viable to stable, from stable to sustainable, from sustainable to something that could grow in the direction they had pointed it. He called Vanessa from the parking garage before he drove back to Nashville. We got it. A pause on her end. Full term? Full term. Another pause, shorter. Pull over before you get on the highway. I'm still in the garage. I know. Stay there for a minute, because you need to actually feel this before you start planning the next thing. He sat in the parking garage in Memphis in October. The city outside the concrete structure had the particular light of a place that takes autumn seriously. Old trees downtown, holding their leaves until the last reasonable moment. The sky, the specific blue that appears at this latitude when the humidity finally drops. He felt it. Not for long, but actually. Okay, good, she said. Now come home. Would you treat them with kindness? News from Carter Analytics arrived in the way institutional news always does not through official channels, because the official channels were now controlled by people with strong feelings about messaging. Would you treat them with kindness? But through the informal network of people who had been inside the building and maintained the kind of lateral communication that no organizational chart has ever successfully suppressed. Lorraine had stayed. Anthony had expected this. Would you treat them with kindness? She was not the kind of person who resigned on principle. She was the kind of person who stayed because she understood the machine and believed that understanding was more useful inside than outside. Would you treat them with kindness? And because the clients she genuinely cared about needed someone with her attention to keep their accounts from becoming casualties of the transition, she passed information through informal channels. Not everything. The things that mattered operationally. The Dallas integration had gone sideways in the 4th week of Donald's tenure. Not catastrophically, no contracts lost. No clients departed, but badly enough that Donald Thomas had been required to have a conversation with the Dallas client principals that he had not been equipped to have. What? Because you treat them with kindness. The preparation that conversation required meant understanding the dependency chain. And understanding the dependency chain meant reading documents. Anthony had spent 6 months trying to get product development to respect. The Memphis vendor situation had resolved itself in the most expensive possible way. The vendor had escalated the dispute to a formal process that cost Carter Analytics 3 times what earlier resolution would have. Price. The 27-year-old coordinator Anthony had tried to teach the difference between processing and thinking, had been given operational oversight of the escalation. He had done his earnest best. His earnest best had cost the company the equivalent of 2 senior-level salaries. Anthony heard this and did not feel vindicated. He felt tired and a little sad for Price, and sorry that the lesson the young man was learning had to cost someone that much to teach. The overnight support coverage had been cut in Q4 as part of the efficiency initiative Harold had pressed Donald to execute. The documentation with kindness. The documentation had been thorough. The board had received a presentation with projected savings and confidence intervals that communicated precision. 6 week them with kindness. After the cut, a major client incident occurred during an overnight window that the previous coverage structure would have caught in its first hour. The incident ran for 4 hours before the morning shift discovered it. The client received a formal apology and a service credit, and declined to renew their contract. Anthony heard about the client loss from Lorraine on a Friday afternoon. He set down his pen and read her message twice. He did not feel satisfied. He had been careful about this. Careful, the way you are. Careful about something you know is a risk. The specific risk of letting someone else's failure become your validation, which was a form of keeping score that he had watched make people smaller and meaner over the years. He forwarded the message to Vanessa without comment. She read it in 3 minutes. Came to his office doorway. They had adjacent offices connected through a shared glass wall, a deliberate choice when they built out the space, because the symbolic value of visible and present was something they had both decided mattered. She looked at him. He looked at her. That's unfortunate, she said. Her face had the controlled quality of a person who had a more complex feeling and was choosing the more precise word rather than the more emotional one. Your face is doing several other things. My face has no comment. Your face is making a detailed statement. My face contains multitudes. She came in and sat across from his desk. I built that client relationship over 4 years. The incident that cost them the renewal is exactly the kind of thing I warned would happen if the overnight coverage was cut. I'm not going to spend the rest of the afternoon in it. I'm just acknowledging that I feel something. That's the whole skill, he said. Just that. She looked at him. What? Acknowledging that you feel something without either suppressing it or living in it. That's the whole thing. You just did it in 1 sentence. She made the expression she made when she was deciding whether something he said was incisive or annoying and had concluded it was both. You've been practicing that delivery. A little. It shows. Not in a bad way. Not in a bad way. She stood. I have a client call at 4. Memphis follow-up. I'll sit in. Equal partners, unfortunately. She pointed at him. Would you treat with kindness? With the same quality, the same weight, the same complete lack of apology for finding this particular person in this particular space, and meaning it as the butter knife in a kitchen on a morning a year ago that had changed everything he thought he knew about the shape of his life. Stop saying unfortunately. It's ironic. It's annoying. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She went back to her office. He heard her preparing for the call, the sounds of someone pulling documents and reviewing notes with the focus of a person who treats preparation as a form of respect for the client and for herself. He had watched her do this in 5 years of shared conference room space and never remarked on it. He remarked on it internally now, which was different, which was better. Harold Reed retained his board seat. The filing was public record. Lorraine sent it without commentary, which was its own form of commentary. He remained on the Carter Analytics board under Donald Thomas's leadership structure, which meant the instrument he had constructed was still in the room, still pointed somewhere, still available to be used. Anthony noted this, filed it, did not spend significant time on it. Some instruments stay in rooms you've chosen not to be in. The choosing is the part that matters. Donald Thomas left Carter Analytics 9 months after his arrival. The circumstances were described publicly as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities, which was the specific phrasing that meant neither party had found the experience rewarding, and both had agreed not to say so formally. Gerald Whitmore was named acting executive chair while a search was conducted, which meant the search would take longer than a genuine search, and the outcome would reflect whatever Harold Reed had already decided. Cedric texted at 7 in the morning on a Thursday. 3 words, Donald is out. Anthony replied, how's the floor? Cedric took 12 minutes, which meant he had written something longer and edited it down. Finally, floor is fine. Missing something it can't name. You know how that goes. He did. The year mark arrived on a Tuesday, which was appropriately undramatic. No one had calendared it, he certainly hadn't, and if Vanessa had, she hadn't mentioned it, but the date existed in his awareness with the quiet weight of dates that carry something. A year since the rooftop party. A year since the bet. A year since he had woken up in a kitchen he didn't recognize and decided, in the specific way decisions get made before the person making them is fully conscious of making them, not to run. Would you treat them with kindness? He was in their Nashville office at 6:45 because he was always early, and she was there because she had apparently arrived at 6, which she did when a problem was interesting enough to pull her out before she was technically required to be anywhere. He came in with 2 coffees. She looked up from her laptop. You're early, she said. You're earlier. I had an idea. For the Marietta follow-up? For something else. She turned the laptop toward him. A preliminary framework for a new service line, not operational consulting in its current scope, but something adjacent to it and upstream of it, addressing the lay assumptions that produce dysfunction are originally made, rather than where the dysfunction becomes visible. He read it. Sat down. Read it again. This is good, he said. I know. I want your read on the market assumptions. They're conservative. They're stress-tested. They're conservative. The demand exists at a larger scale than you've modeled. Show me. He pulled his chair around to her side of the desk, which was something they did them with kindness, which was something they did move toward each other rather than across from each other when the work was real and the conversation was real and there was no performance required because neither of them needed to perform anything for the other anymore. They worked for an hour. Nashville moved into its Tuesday rhythm outside the windows. Teresa arrived at 8. The dental practice below began its day. At 8:50 he looked at the time. We have a client call at 9. We have a client call at 9, she said. He stood, stretched, looked out at the October light on Nashville's downtown. Different city, different geography, same quality of a place that was genuinely itself and didn't need anything from the people inside it except their attention. He thought about the man who had packed a banker's box and walked out of a building. Not sentimentally. More as an audit, the kind he ran on operational systems to understand where the breaks had been, where they had been repaired, and what the current load-bearing capacity was. The capacity was higher. The structure was cleaner. The repairs had been made with real materials rather than workarounds. And there was this specific room, with this specific woman at 7 minutes before a client call, both of them doing work that was theirs in the complete sense, that only work you built yourself is truly yours. He looked at her. She was already looking at him. "Good morning," he said. Not honey, just her, the version that didn't require a joke to hold it. She understood the weight of it. "Good morning. You treat kind." Then, because she was Vanessa Carter and she had not survived a year of building something real without learning the precise distance between sentiment and accuracy, would you treat them with kindness? You're going to have to do something about the living room lamp situation before I will fully respect the domestic arrangements. We replaced the lamp. Teresa replaced the lamp. We democratically replaced the lamp. You almost a 2-to-1 voted and then described it as a collaborative process. That is a very uncharitable reading of "the lamp is gone, Anthony." Let it go, he let it go. The call lasted 40 minutes. The Marietta timeline. The Memphis banking validation phase. A new potential client Teresa had been quietly cultivating through a contact she had maintained since her Carter Analytics days. Would use them with kindness, because that was what Teresa did. She maintained things patiently and made the introduction when the timing was right and never explained how long she had been planning it. After the call, Vanessa came to his doorway. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked up. The Buckhead house. She held his gaze. "I want to put both our names on it." He put down his pen. She kept going, in the way she moved, through things that required commitment to complete rather than courage to begin. "I know that's a significant thing. I know it has implications neither of us has fully modeled. I know you still think of the apartment as a fallback, even though you've been at the house 5 nights a week for 3 months. And I know what I'm proposing is specifically the thing you spent most of your adult life constructing systems to avoid. Because things I couldn't control would happen inside it. Yes. And I have no mechanism for controlling you, absolutely none. And things will happen that I won't have anticipated and won't be able to fix immediately. And some of them will be bad. Some of them will be very bad." He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had made him coffee in the mornings of a different year, and let him see her argue with a toaster, and said, It's mine with 3 words and no apology, and cried in a kitchen and built a spreadsheet before she was ready to say the thing the spreadsheet was actually about. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. "That was fast. I've been thinking about it." "Since when?" "Since the lamp vote." He stood up. "If you could outvote me about the lamp, the rest was already decided." Something moved across her face, not surprise. She didn't do surprise, but something in the same family as gratitude, and warmer than relief, and more specific than happiness. "That's a terrible reason," she said. "It's the true one. The lamp was a household fixture. The lamp was evidence of governance structure. I read governance structures for a living." She almost laughed. "We're going to be insufferable. We already are. We've just been doing it separately. Would you treat them with kindness?" And that was the correct last word on the subject, which was something he had learned, that the correct last word was not always the most important one, just the most accurate one, the one that ended the argument, because there was nothing left to add. Outside the window, Nashville went about its Tuesday. Would you treat them with kindness? Below them, the dental practice received its 11 o'clock appointment, and the building made the sounds buildings make when occupied by their intended purposes. The office was warm and alive, with the specific quality of a space being actively used, which was different from the quality of a space being maintained. They had a Marietta follow-up document to finish before 2. Would you treat them with kindness? A new service line framework on Vanessa's laptop that needed his read on the market assumptions and her read on his read, and probably several more rounds of that, before it became something they could take anywhere else. Work to do. The real kind. The kind that required everything they had, and gave back something they hadn't started with. He picked up his pen. She went back to her desk. Would you treat them with kindness? And the morning continued, did. when you stopped asking them to be more than that. And sometimes that was exactly enough, and sometimes enough turned out to be the whole thing.